Okay, let's start the class. In the last class what we were talking about bryophytes, and we have almost completed it. In the last part of the group, we have talked about the bryophyte. What we remember, the plant body is a sporophyte and a gametophyte. The plant body is a gametophyte, right? Gametophyte ki thake sex organs bilak thake, Entridium and Archegonium. Sex organs of ki thake male gamete and female gamete. Both the gamete used to fuse and ultimately they will produce the sporophyte. Where is the sporophyte produced? It is produced on the gametophyte itself. Talking about the sporophyte, it is totally or partially dependent on the gametophyte. Parts of a sporophyte, food, seta and capsule, right? The spores are born on the capsule. What is the function of the seta? It gives a proper height to the capsule, right? Next, after the spore gets dispersed in the soil, they either go for direct germination or they will go for indirect germination. Direct germination is seen generally in case of lower bryophytes, Rixia, Markensia, etc. But in case of higher bryophyte, that is Bryopsida or Musci or moss, whatever you say, in that case, we have seen something called as indirect germination of a spore. What we understand by indirect germination, the spore will germinate into a structure that is called as protonema. And what is protonema? It is nothing but a filamentous structure. Bahut gita cell or at a thread like structure that is called as protonema. In the protonema, you will see the formation of buds, and these buds will ultimately germinate to form the new plant. What is the new plant we are talking about? We are talking about the gametophyte itself, right? So this was the portion we have done. Today what we are going to do is we are going to talk about the moss capsule in details. There are certain parts of the moss capsule that you need to know, right? And certain examples of bryophytes. So heading koriba capsule of moss. Yeah, please. Okay, a rough diagram of the capsule of a moss. What you need to remember is, so a diagram to tenike questions raha nai, but what you need to remember, the points that are important. First, there are three parts in a moss capsule, that is operculum, theca and apophysis, right? That's the first point. Second point is something called as peristome teeth. Remember, we have talked about peristome teeth in the last class. What is the function of the peristome teeth? Dispersal of the spores. They are teeth-like in nature, and so they are called as peristome teeth. Talking about peristome teeth, how many layers could you see? You can see 2 layers of peristome teeth. We will be writing about it. Question is asked about the number of peristome teeth that is present in the moss capsule. It is 32, 16 plus 16, 16 in one row and the 16 in the other row. So, we will write that down. Next is the spore sac. We understand spores will disperse. Surrounding the spore sac, we have the air sac, we have something called as the trabeculae. Trabeculae ki hoy, the air sacs or major into septa ba partition, that is what is called as trabeculae, not very important. Next is coming to a word called as columella. Last class we have talked about the columella. What is columella? The mass of sterile tissues inside the capsule is called as columella, right? What is the function of the columella? It helps in absorbing or providing water and minerals to the growing spores, right? Next we have columella into extended portion, that is what is called as conducting tissues. Conducting tissues will obviously found in the seta, because whenever we are talking about the capsule, it's nothing but the sporophyte that we are talking about, right? Sporophyte boli kole ki thakibo food, seta and capsule. So it was a capsule hoy tar tolor part khini ki hobo, setae hobo, right? So in the seta we will see certain conducting tissues, and plus we have a word called as stomata. Question has been asked is, are stomata found in the moss capsule? Yes, stomata are found in the moss capsule. Second point is, where exactly can you find the stomata? The stomata is found in the area called as apophysis, right? So that these are the points that you have to remember. You don't have to write anything, just diagram to saba, diagram to saipele monot rakhiba. Operculum, it's also called as lid of the capsule, right? Next we have a word called as annulus, right? Annulus ki hoy, it is that area where the moss capsule or the capsule will dehisce. We know whenever we talking, suppose we talk about pollen grains, no? Pollen grains ko thakibo anther bitorat, right? If you talk about that anther, the anther needs to dehisce and only then the pollen grains will come out. So we have a particular area where the anther will dehisce, right? Anther boli koa loge loge, if you are talking about the stamen part, no? So yate ki thakibo pollen grains thakibo. So pollen grains bilak disperse hobo lagile anther to burst koribo lagibo nalage, right? Now the point is, where will the, or in which part or in which position the anther will burst? Depending on plants to plants, they have different areas where the anther bursts. But in general, we use a word called as, if you have heard, obviously we have heard because we have done sexual reproduction in flowering plants, and in that chapter we have discussed about this. What is tomium? The line of dehiscence in case of an anther is called as tomium, right? Jote phati jabo, suppose it goes for longitudinal splitting. So जो split करे, that line, that imaginary line is called as the stomium, right? So similarly, in case of a moss capsule also, inside the capsule we know the spores are present and the capsule leads to dehisce. Dehiscent sport hobo, is this in this part or which part? It is the annulus. What is annulus? The area where the spore capsule will dehisce and the spores will come out, right? So egita points as জানিব লাগে, just সৰু সৰুকে লিখিম. Is the diagram over? নাই হোৱা? ঠিক আছে, ডায়াগ্ৰামটো লিখাচোন. পইণ্টছ কেইটামান লিখি দিওঁ. हाँ हाँ Is this part over? Over? If this is over, examples of bryophytes bully heading koriba. Etu hol peristome teeth or key questions ahise. First, they are hygroscopic in nature. Hygroscopic in nature mane they can absorb water, no? Because we know the spores are inside the capsule. Our capsule to phatibo lagile, it should do something extra. What it does it absorbs water, gets swollen up and then it bursts. Right? And who helps it? It's always the peristome teeth. Question is asked about the number of peristome teeth and they are arranged in how many rows or layers? 2 layers. Eta upor eta tolot. And iman details nalage. Kothabi? Just read aru, question has never been asked as to what is the name of the outer layer, what is the name of the inner layer, which one is hygroscopic, which one is not hygroscopic. Iman nalage. We will be confined with this only. Right? 16 plus 16. And another question that we have studied in the last class, are elaters present in a moss capsule? No. Instead of elaters, what we see? Peristome teeth, right? Examples of mosses bully likha, not bryophytes. Examples of bryophytes we have already done, Rixia, Markensey, etc. Happened. Yes, we'll do the class like this or what? Sphagnum likha, peat moss, quacking moss. Ki koriba? Can you see the board? No. What about the online students? Can you see the board? Ekko dekha nai no? Okkoman rua. এতিয়া দেখা পাইছানে? Online students? Okay. So certain examples of moss, and out of all these, what is the most important example is obviously sphagnum. Sphagnum is called as bog moss, it is also called as quacking moss, carpet moss, turf moss, peat moss, etc. So you have a lot of names for that, right? When is sphagnum called as a peat moss? When we are talking about fossilization of sphagnum, right? We understand something called as a fossil fuel. Janu ne? Fossil fuel, janu no? What is a fossil? The dead deposits, that is called as a fossil. Sphagnum gosdal mori joar pisot, once it become a deposit, once it become fossil, that fossilized part could be used as a fuel, and that is what is called as peat moss, right? So when is sphagnum called as a peat moss? When it gets fossilized. Next, it is also called as absorbent cotton because it has a capacity to retain water, similarly with the normal cotton that we use. Okay, out of this what I said, sphagnum is important, and next saprophytic moss. Many questions has been asked about the word saprophytic moss because we know mosses are photosynthetic in nature. Kintu saprophytic hole ki hobo? Non photosynthetic. So we have an exception. So the question is asked about the exception. Give an example of a saprophytic moss. So saprophytic moss ki hobo? Boxbomia. If this is over, importance of bryophytes boli likhiba. So this is all about bryophytes. So talking about the importance of bryophyte, ecological role is more important. What is the ecological role we are talking about? Ecological succession, right? Colonize rocks mane, they will come and settle on the rock, because we know the rock needs to get converted into soil, and who helps in the process? First is the lichens, after lichens the role is of the mosses. And checks erosion. How do they check erosion or they prevent erosion? Because we have been using a word called as carpet moss, right? Bryophytes normally sphagnum, tegnum, they grow like a carpet, and whenever they grow like a carpet, if the rain falls, no, they will be able to retain the soil and plus retain the water also. So as a result, iman details nalage. The question has been asked about ecological succession and fossil fuel and this one, right? Living tissues transfer, but living tissues transport koribo lagile. What is that we use? As an example of bryophyte is this diagram. And apart from these, the diagrams that are given in your NCERT book, right? NCERT book or jigi diagrams ase, identify the following figures buli ahe. So each and every plant that is given, please look into that. So once we are completed with bryophytes, we have to talk about the next group, that is pteridophytes. If this is over, heading koriba pteridophytes. One second, huh? Kuntu? Funaria species loi kotha ase. Funaria is a genus, right? Funaria to species thakibo no. Species loi we have to be specific. We have to be in species, in regards to species we can be using that term. All of a sudden as a whole general term eta use kori dibo noaru, right? Okay, please, Kwa. Have more ecological importance than economic importance. Tar mane bryophytes bilakor economic importance otke besike ecologically he tahat besi useful. Ecological useful mane bryophytes, if you talk about tahator major role ba function of bryophytes boli jeri koa tetia hale ecological succession ot he tahate besi bhalke help kore, right? Karon economic importance iman besi nai. Economic importance jodi swa no, it is only about one moss that we are talking about. We are concerned with sphagnum. Okal eta example of moss juntu niki economically used ase. But if we are talking about ecological importance, it's all types of moss that plays a role in ecological succession. Eta moss use korise economic values ase karne aru baki sob moss bilakor ki value ase, ecological value ase. Ekan sobotse besi value ki ase, ecological. Buji paisa? I think I can wrap the code now. Okay, after bryophytes, the next group of plants is pteridophytes. Okay, bryophytes are jenike first some of the points we have spoken about it, and then we have started writing the notes. Similar in the case of pteridophytes also. Whenever we talk of pteridophytes, certain points to remember. First, the plant body. The plant body is a sporophyte, right? Because we will be using the words called as sporophyte, gametophyte and thallophyte. Plant body of pteridophyte is a sporophyte. Second, it is considered as the first land plants. If it is considered as the first land plants, then vascular tissues present, nay absent. Vascular tissue is present, because we have seen that in case of bryophytes, no doubt they were called as amphibians, but in spite of that, vascular tissues were absent. So pteridophytes are vascular tissues present. If you talk about vascular tissues, we know we are talking about xylem and phloem, but well developed vascular tissues absent. Vascular tissues present, but well developed vascular tissues absent. Kiho karne? Because one cell of the xylem and one cell of the phloem, that is absent. Which is absent? We are talking about absence of vessels from the xylem section and the absence of companion cells from the phloem section, right? Gute sarita cells of xylem or sarita cells of phloem are present in which group of plants? Is present in only in case of angiosperms. From pteridophytes onwards to gymnosperms, no doubt vascular bundles are present, kintu well defined vascular bundles nohoy, right? Next, obviously we have certain exceptions we will talk about, but in general well developed vascular bundles absent. Since well-developed vascular bundles are absent, they cannot be considered as the most successful land plants. They are successful land plants, but not the most successful land plants because of the same reason. First this one. Second reason is their dependency on water for fertilization. Right, whenever we talk about this is always considered as a primitive character, right. So, hekarone tahanok well defined ba most advanced plants boli ami consider koribo nwaro. Next, talking about the plant called as Sporophyte, obviously they will produce gametophyte, right. So, we will have that relation. So, alternation of generation is something that we will see. In case of Bryophytes also we have seen where we have talked about the Sporophyte completely dependent on the gametophyte, but in case of Pteridophyte we will study a line called as the Sporophyte and the gametophyte are totally independent. Right. So, hetu eta unique characteristic of a pteridophyte. Jeneka bryophyte or unique characteristic ki asile that they are dependent either partially or totally, but in case of pteridophyte they are completely independent. Next, talking about pteridophytes, certain examples that we have to talk about. Pteridophytes boli kole we have to talk about the highest pteridophyte, that is ferns. When will you call a plant as a fern? It should have certain characteristics and only then you will consider a plant as a fern. The most common fern that you see in your day-to-day life, right? So, that is an example of a fern. So, what is the best characteristic to define a fern? First is they will have something called as Surgeonate coiling. Surgeonate coiling mane, I don't know whether you have seen or not, young dhekia bilako upor ta coil thake na thake. So, any plant that will show coiling in the young leaves, right, that is what is called as Surgeonate vernation or Surgeonate coiling. If that is present, then that plant could be considered as a fern. Right. Second point about a fern is it should have motile male gametes. We will be talking about all those. Next is the stem should be a rhizome. What is a rhizome morphology? We have already done. It is an underground stem, right. Rhizome or best example ki asle ginger, right. So, the stem should be a rhizome. Next, if it has to be a fern, it has to have certain hair-like structure that is called as ramenta. Again, coming back to that example that we see, what is the part that we eat? It is nothing but the leaf, right? That is a young leaf that we eat. Right? If you see that young leaf, no, eneke apan coiling thakibo, no, young leaf ot ki thakibo, yete sabason okman hair-like structures kisman dekha baba. It's not a very smooth structure, no, certain hair eneke dekha baba, right? So, this is what is called as ramenta. This is called as coiling, right, and this develops from rhizome, right. Next, this is the young leaf. In case of a matured leaf, we will have something like this. Right. So, in case of leaves also we need to talk about. Next, we have two words associated with leaves. Jehetu the plant body is a sporophyte, no? Sporophyte boli kole tat ki thakibo, roots, stems and leaves would be present. So, certain characteristics of stems, certain characteristics of roots and certain characteristics of leaves. When we talk about leaves, 2 points that we need to remember. One are called as tropophyll and the other called as a sporophyll. If you hear the word phyll, we know that we are talking about leaves, P-H-Y-L-L. Sporophyll means what? Spore bearing leaves are called as sporophylls, right. So, similarly in case of pteridophytes, two types of leaves, tropophyll and sporophyll. What is a sporophyll? Since it bears the spores, it is called as a sporophyll and it is also considered as the reproductive leaf. Kintu tropophyll ki hobo? Vegetative leaf. Jetyaleke spore formation nai kora, that type of a leaf would be called as a tropophyll. In case of fern, have you seen the development of a spore? Have you seen ferns? Not this example, any fern that you see, like especially if you go to some hilly areas, no? Hills bilakot ki thake, ferns bilak thake, no? Have you seen a fern? No. You have not seen a fern? Very good. Whenever you see a fern, you close your eyes. Fern dekha nai, dekhi sa mon kora nai. So, okay, the point over here is, in case of, okay, let's not talk about fern first. Pteridophytes as a whole, if you talk about the reproductive structure, we see something called as a cone, C-O-N-E. I think you have heard the word cone. The word cone is more associated with the gymnosperms, cycasaur cone, right? Hetu to janu ami. That cone actually ki hoy? What is a cone? Have you seen the cycas cone? cone, right? It was generally cone proper structure ko dekha pao gymnosperms oto, but in spite of that certain types of pteridophytes also show the presence of cones, not all pteridophytes, right? What is a cone? We need to know. Cone yate ki hoy, these are made up of leaves. So what is a cone? Accumulation of leaves is called as a cone. Which type of a leaf? Sporophylls. Karon cone tor bitorot ki thakibo? Spores. It's nothing but a reproductive unit of the plant, right? So certain pteridophytes will develop spores inside a cone, certain pteridophytes will develop spores on the leaf itself, right? So if it is formed on the leaf, then we'll be using the word called as Stropophyll and Sporophyll, and the best example is a fern. In case of fern, we do not see cone formation, but in case of other examples of pteridophytes like Lycopodium, Selaginella, bahut bilak examples ase no, tat ami ki dekha pao spore cone formation. For example, if you talk about Selaginella, no, almost looks something like this. We'll draw in details later because two examples we need to study in details. One is Selaginella and the other is fern, right? Jeneke gymnosperms ot ami Cycas aru Pinus will study in detail. Similarly, in case of pteridophytes, Selaginella and fern will study in details. At that time, we'll draw the diagram. As of now, I just want to say that if you are talking about a fern, fern is an example of a pteridophyte, Selaginella is also an example of a pteridophyte. Both of them, in both the cases, you will see the reproductive structure that is called as spore. Where will the spore be found? The spore would be found either in cone or strobili, or it could be found in the leaf itself, right? So once the leaf gets matured, no, after maturity, only then the spores will be formed. Jetialeke leaf to mature nohoy, tetialeke spore bilak formation nohoy. So the young leaf will never have spores. Once the leaves mature, then only the spores will be formed. Young leaves are called as Stropophylls because they do not have spores, so they are considered as vegetative leaves, and so they are called as Stropophylls. Once the leaf gets matured, spores starts developing, and at that time the leaf is considered as a reproductive leaf, and we have a name for that, that is called as a Sporophyll. Are the two terms clear now? Sporophyll, Tropophyll, clear. Okay, so that was in case of fern. In case of certain things, certain plants like Selaginella, they will also have a spore bearing structure that is called as a cone or strobili. Who forms the cone? Cone is nothing but a compact structure, no? Kiba bostu compact hoi pelai cone form korise. Ki compact hoise? Ebilak ki hoy? Nothing but leaves. Ebilak ki hoy? These are also leaves, right? And these are also collection of leaves. These leaves are called as Tropophyll because they are vegetative leaves. You will not see the spores here, but in case of such plants, yate spore dekha pam, ekini leaves ok ami ki boli kom? Sporophyll. So what is a cone? A compact structure of sporophyll forms a cone. Cone is also called as strobili. Question ahe, give the examples of pteridophytes where you can see the cone, examples of pteridophytes where cone is absent. Best example is fern where the cone is absent. Best example is Selaginella where you find the cone, right? So inside the cone you will have the spores. Now talking about spores again, in Bryophytes also we have seen the development of spores, in pteridophytes also we will see the development of the spores, but we will be using two words again, homosporous and heterosporous condition. In case of Bryophytes ami ki use korisilo, all the spores are morphologically similar, and so we have used a word called as homosporous. In case of pteridophytes, both the two conditions would be seen, homosporous to dekha pam, heterosporous to dekha pam, but the point to be remembered is what is the most common thing? It is the homosporous condition that is most commonly available or commonly seen, right? Since it's commonly seen, question to generally tarpra nahe. Question ahibo heterosporous condition or example dia. We have 5 examples of heterosporous pteridophytes. Hegita example hai basic monot rakhibo laibo, right? Homosporous we understood, heterosporous boli kole ki hobo? One small, one big, one microspore, one megaspore. So similar, this is the way that with the discussion will proceed. Next is, again since we are talking about pteridophytes or comparison koribo laibo na, as we said no, Bryophytes or logot compare koribo laibo. So Bryophytes or logot regarding the male gametes also, biflagellate, uniflagellate, comma shaped or spiral shaped, Remember we have drawn that Entridium and the Archegonium in case of Bryophyte. Similarly, we are going to draw it in case of Pteridophytes also. So, duitary spores bilak kenekwa, duitary male gamete kenekwa. As far as the process of fertilization is concerned, exactly the same in case of Bryophytes also, because both of them depend on water. Both of them will have something called as chemotaxis, and because of chemotaxis, the male gamete would go and fuse with the female gamete inside the archegonium. Clear? So, ekhini hol eta rough discussion. Okay, together with this, this was the basic information about that group called as Pteridophyte. But in this group, we need to talk something about stele also. Concept of stele is something that we need to study during Pteridophytes. Now, before studying about concept of stele, you should have an idea what a stele is. Stele ki hoy? A group of tissues. Where exactly can you find the stele? To remember stele, we have one line, that is the seat of the vascular bundle is called as stele. Not a very scientific line, not a proper definition for stele. The seat of the vascular bundle. Janike, do you remember we have said something called as the seat of a flower is called as thalamus. Remember the word thalamus or receptacle. What is thalamus or receptacle? The seat of the flower is called as a thalamus or receptacle. Obviously not a scientific definition. So, if you talk about this one, eto kami ki koise thalamus or receptacle in case of a flower. In case of stele, stele ki hoy? It's a group of tissues. Which type of tissues? Parenchyma tissues. What you will find in this group? The vascular bundles. Now, the point is, where exactly can you find the vascular bundle in a plant? Vascular bundles kot pa? Ekdom upor thake niki? If you see a plant, is it the xylem and the phloem that you see first? No, what do you see? You see the epidermis first or the bark first, right? So, what is stele then? It is the innermost area, right? Innermost area mane, again don't get confused between stele and pith, right? I think you have heard something called as pith, right? This is also a group of parenchymatous tissues that occupies the centermost position, no? Tar surrounding of jimanbor tissues ase, tak ami ki boli kom? Not necessary. Each and every stele will have a pith. We will go for the discussion, we will understand all these things. As of now, stele ki hoy? A group of tissues, or a tissues bilakote ki pai? Vascular bundles bilak pai. Xylem, phloem, we kot paba ekhini jegat. Because again we have to talk from that part, that is TS of a stem or a root. If you go for a TS, tetel ami ki dekha pam? Sab arrangement of tissues, right? So, arrangement of tissues keneke asile? Epidermis, cortex, endodermis, pericycle. Epidermis, cortex, endodermis, pericycle. What inner to pericycle? Inner to pericycle to hollow structure hobo nware no, tato to tissues ase. So, inner to pericycle ki pam? That group of tissues, that collection of tissues inner to the pericycle is called as stele. It is in the stele where you will see the vascular bundles. Right? Why we have to talk about stele in Pteridophytes? Because we know vascular bundles have started developing from Pteridophytes itself. Right? So, vascular bundles will all of a sudden keneke develop korile. It cannot grow like this, no? Che kopar pra upor pra ahile topki porile teneka to hobo nware. It has to grow from somewhere, right? So, it is from that stellar tissues that gradually the pith, the vascular bundles have started developing. So, unscientific definition, just to remember, what we remember is the stele is the seat of vascular bundle. So, if you remember that line, you have an idea, the stele to kot pam. It's just the innermost area of a stem or a root, right? So, how did the stele develop? We have to talk about the most primitive type of stele, the most advanced type of stele. If the question is asked, the most advanced type of stellar structure is found in which plants? It is found in the highest plant, obviously that would be angiosperms, right? So, from till angiosperms, we have certain terms, and again, if you have heard monostele, Siphenostele, solenostele, ectactostele, dictyostele, these are the different types of stele, right? So, we will be talking about the evolution of stele within this group also, right? So, this was Pteridophytes. Eta notes likhu. From Pteridophyte section, jeneke Bryophytes are sphagnum or maximum question ahe. From Pteridophyte section, the question has been asked about Selaginella, right? Selaginella bahut questions ahe. Selaginella ahe, ferns or ahe. Have you heard something called as resurrection plant. Resurrection plant or question ahe kintu. Resurrection, the act of resurrection. What is resurrection? Something related with K? Jesus Christ. Resurrection hoy no hoy? Ki hoy? Morar pisat puti thoi di ako jiai jai na jai. You become alive after you die. That is what is called as resurrection, right? So it is believed that Jesus Christ had or showed resurrection because he was put into a grave. Remember that cross? Crossot thoisile, crossot ki korisil? Nail down kori dise, all full of nails. After that, what was done to the body? Put it in a grave, right? The grave, the entrance of the grave was covered with a stone. But little later, what the people could see? The door was open, the body was not there. So they believe that maybe he died and he was reborn. So once you die and you are reborn, that is what is called as resurrection. That's just a way to understand, right? We have a plant that is called as a resurrection plant, that is called as Selaginella. One example of a Selaginella. Kiho karne? Because we have a specific example of Selaginella that grows in dry areas, desert areas bilakot grow kore. That Selaginella, because of wind or air, gets uprooted, forms a round ball-like structure and moves from one place to the other. Eta jagat grow kori ase, botah dise, botah dia karne since Selaginella is a lower plant. Ki hoy? Tahator to root system to iman strong no hoy no. So they get uprooted. Uproot hoar pisot they will turn itself into a round brown ball-like structure carried with the help of wind from one place to the another. If you look into the journey, you will see as if the plant has died. Because it's brown in color, it has become a roll-like a structure, a globular structure. Dekhile kenekua lagibo jen mori gol. Once that plant is carried from one area to the other area, in the new area, if it receives water, jedi borokhune dile, but it gets a water source, it will grow back again. It will become green again. So that is what is called as resurrection. Since they show this capacity, they are called as resurrection plant. Hetu upor question ahe. Next, aru eta question ahe, Sanjeevani Booty, that Hanuman wala. Right? So that is also Sanjeevani, I mean it's considered as which plant? Selaginella bryopteris. So egitar upor question ahibo. Pteridophyte likha, the term pteridophyte was given by Ernest Haeckel. Yesterday we have talked about a word called as amphibians of the plant kingdom. Today we are talking about reptiles of the plant kingdom. So pteridophytes বুলি ক'লে vascular cryptogram, cryptogram is a word that we remember, right? Okay, they are not considered as successful land plants. Then they have xylem and phloem, but in the xylem they lack vessels, in the phloem they lack companion cells. But we have certain exceptions of bryophytes, sorry, pteridophytes where vessels are seen, Selaginella marcellia, right? Because we will have to talk about evolution. Gradually in the process of evolution, vessels started developing. But these are exceptions. But if the question is asked, are vessels present in pteridophytes, the answer would be no, right? Next. Huh? Companion cells key. Companion cells or kam key. They help in or they assist the vessels and tracheids. It's the neighboring cell, no? Vessels and tracheids be like dead cell hoy, no? So tahatoko to bostu be like transport koribo lagibo. So companion cells, it is a vessel hoy. The next adjoining cell is the companion cell. Companion cell is the living cell, right? We'll study about it in plant anatomy in details, right? Next is talking about secondary growth. What we know about secondary growth? What is secondary growth? Each and every plant have two types of growth. One is called as the primary growth and the other is called as secondary growth. What is primary growth? Starting from the point of germination, that type of a growth that every plant shows, that is what is called as primary growth. What is secondary growth? The increase in thickness is called as secondary growth. Second point about secondary growth, not every plant shows secondary growth. If a plant has to show secondary growth, it will let a special tissue lagibo, that is called as cambium, right? Cambium or secondary growth in case of angiosperms, it is confined to monocots and dicots, is confined to only the dicots. Monocots, for example, rice, wheat, sugarcane, etc. Tahator keteo secondary growth nathake. Kiho kare nathake karon cambium nathake. Similarly, in case of pteridophytes also, we see that secondary growth is absent, but in spite of that we have an exception. Right? Our type of a pteridophyte that where secondary growth is present is Isoetes and Botrydium. Tahat bilakor ki hoy, no doubt they are pteridophytes, no doubt they are fern-like in nature, but they are huge. Their girth is thick. Tahate bahut hokot hoy jay. Aru hokot hobo lagile secondary growth hoboi lagibo, right? Next, as far as the type of plants that is seen in this group, some of them are very small, some are tall, some are climbers, some as tall as 6 to 7 feet in height also, that is called as a tree fern. Example of a climber or example of a pteridophyte that is a climber, Lycopodium. Next point. Next, since the plant body is a sporophyte, it will have stem, leaves and roots. Characteristics of stem, leaves and roots. Okay, if you are talking about roots, generally two terms we talk about, either we are talking about the taproot system or we are talking about the adventitious root system. In case of pteridophytes, what is the type of root system that you are going to see? Taproot and adventitious root. How will you know whether a plant has a taproot and an adventitious root? If you can uproot the plant easily, then obviously the plant would have key adventitious roots. Right, taproot ki hoy, the main primary root that will penetrate deep inside the soil, that is called as the taproot. Aur jodi besi tolle jay, obviously you cannot lift up that plant, right, or you cannot uproot the plant. But in case of ferns, easily to be uproot koribo pora. So what is the type of root that they have? Adventitious roots. You have to know the word majority because we have talked about a fern that is called as a tree fern that is 4 to 5 feet in height. So adult gauze is 4 to 5 feet in height hoy, tak to go play easily uproot kori dibo nwara no. So tahator ki thakibo, taproot thakibo, but in majority of the cases, in case of pteridophytes, we will see adventitious roots. Stems are a point, huh? Okay. In case of stems, erect or prostrate, we understand erect or prostrate, woody or non-woody, right? If you are talking about non-woody, it could be rhizome or it could be aerial. When we talk about rhizome, obviously we are talking about what? Underground. So if it's non-woody, it could be underground or it could be aerial, above the ground. We also have examples of creeping stem, climbers, no? Example Lycopodium. Next, in case of stems, we see in certain cases the stems has been specialized for photosynthesis. What is the term for that? Adult stem e jodi photosynthesis kore he stem dalok ami ki boli ko? From morphology point of view, that was a very important question from morphology. Remember this diagram, morphology it. Punsia. Right? So green kyo kan chlorophyll ase, jedi chlorophyll ase, photosynthesis kune koribo, stem dale koribo. Normally photosynthesis kune kore, it's always the leaves that conducts photosynthesis, but in case of such plants, they have modified or very reduced leaves in the form of spines, right? So photosynthesis kune koribo, stem. A stem conducting photosynthesis is called as something that starts with P. Phylloclade. So in case of pteridophytes also we can see phylloclade. So phylloclade ko dekha pam, examples like Selaginella, Equisetum, etc. Is it over? Okay. Next I leaves likhim. What was that? So again two words, macrophyllous and microphyllous leaves. Two types of leaves or presence of two types of leaves is a characteristic of pteridophytes. In case of bryophyte, we have seen all the leaves to be same, right? So yate kisuman leaves either it will be very small, kisuman hobo it will be big. If you are comparing Selaginella and a fern, fern leaves are bigger, so they are called as macrophyllous, and Selaginella or Lycopodium, in those cases the leaves are smaller and so they are called as microphyllous. So two types of leaves could be seen in case of pteridophytes. Similarly, in case of pteridophytes, again two words, নাই হোৱা? So, leaves of site are termed microphyllus, macrophyllus, tropophyll, sporophyll, right. Talking about sporophyll, many of the sporophylls combine together to form a cone. Here we have already written, but sporophylls are called as sporophylls because they will have spores in them. যেহেতু spores আছে সেইকাৰণে সেই leafটোক আমি কি বুলি কওঁ sporophyll বুলি কওঁ. So, where will you find the spores? The spores will be found inside a spore sac that is called a sporangium. So, sporophyll is a leaf. Leafot কি থাকিব এটা sac থাকিব that is called a sporangium. Inside the sporangium কি থাকিব spores থাকিব. Clear? So, we have written sporophylls bear sporangium, sporangium bears spores. Is this part over? Next, some point about spores. Right. So, most of the pteridophytes are homosporous, but we have certain examples that shows heterosporous condition. What is heterospory? Formation of two different types of spores is called as heterospory, right. Since we are concerned with two most important examples in case of pteridophyte, that is one is fern and the other is Selaginella. So, ferns are homosporous, they are heterosporous, they are homosporous. Selaginella homosporous, they are heterosporous, heterosporous. If you talk about ferns, we have not written any word called as fern here, but we have written the examples of ferns, right. Whenever you hear words like pteris, Bryopteris, Adiantum, Marsalia, all these are examples of ferns, right. So, ferns be like generally ki ho, not Marsalia, sorry. So, if you are talking about some specific ferns, tete hale tahat ki hobo যে they are homosporous and most of the pteridophytes homosporous হ'ব কিন্তু ইয়াতে এইকিটা specific example মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব so the question that is asked is identify the homosporous or the heterosporous if you remember the heterosporous rest everything would be homosporous কাৰণ heterosporous আমি কেইটা example 1 2 3 4 5 it's only 5 examples that you will remember rest যিমানেই pteridophyte নিদিয়ে সব কি হ'ব homosporous হ'ব so remember heterosporous বুলি ক'লে the trick মাছিটো মনত ৰাখিবা so you can write it down right Talking about unique characteristics of pteridophyte, two of the unique characters we have already spoken about. One was the relation between the gametophyte and the sporophyte, and second is the sporophyte or the sporophyll being photosynthetic. So, duita. Last class also we have written this line. Spore will germinate. Talking about germination, endosporic germination and exosporic germination. In case of pteridophytes, কেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ germination হ'ব? Exosporic. In case of bryophytes, কেনেকুৱা ধৰণৰ আছিলে? Where did the spore germinate? In the soil itself. So it was also exosporic. This is understood? তলৰখিনি হোৱা নাই লিখি লোৱা Dominant phase of the plant body. Since we know both sporophyte and the gametophytic phases are present in the plant, which phase is dominant? It's the sporophytic phase that is dominant. If we talk about the sporophyte, the ploidy is something that we know. What is the ploidy of the sporangium? Twice n. What is the ploidy of the sporophyte? Obviously twice n. Spore mother cells twice n, rest n. The gametophyte in case of pteridophyte is called as protellus, right. Okay, so this is the portion that we will discuss today, rest in the next class. So, up till here what we have learnt is the plant body of the pteridophyte is called as the sporophyte. The sporophyte will develop spores, the spores will disperse and then they will germinate in soil, that is called as exosporic germination. Because of germination they will form a gametophyte. The name of the gametophyte is called as protellus. Now, what is the ploidy of the protellus? N. Right, এই বস্তুটো মনত ৰাখিব লাগিব, protellus is N. Next, talking about the protellus, right, since it's something that is developed from the sporophyte itself. Sporophyte to kintu vascular asile because vascular tissues were present, but in case of protellus, non-vascular, right. Next, sporophyte and protellus, dependent ne independent? Independent, because we have already written the sentence called as the sporophytic phase and the gametophytic phase in case of pteridophytes are totally independent, dependent in case of bryophytes, right. So, we have written this line, right. In the protellus, since the protellus will grow in the soil, absorption or karone tahatok ki lagibo, they will not have roots, instead what they will have is rhizoids, right. But in case of the sporophyte tahator ki asile, roots asile, right. Kisumanor rhizoids, kisumanor roots thakibo. So, I think that is all for today. Next, we will continue in the next class. Thank you.